begin with a poem by the IsiXhosa-speaking teacher and poet St. J. Page Yakon. In its English translation, it is called The Contraction and Enclosure of the Land. Thus spake the heirs of the land, although it is no longer ours. This land will be folded up like a blanket until it is like the palm of my hand. The racing ox will become entangled in the wire, too weak to dance free. It will be worn out by the dance of the yoke and the plough. They will crowd us together like tadpoles in a calabash handle. Our girls will have their lobola paid with paper, with coins that come and go, Blood should not be spilled, so they say nowadays, to unite the different peoples, until we no longer care for each other, as a cow licks her calf when love and nature urges her to do so. Can money bring people together? Yes, a man may have words with his son's wife. His son no longer needs to respect her mother. Yes, we fold up our knees. It is impossible to stretch out because the land has been hedged in. Ankie Krog performed this poem at the Plaas Symposium commemorating the centenary of the 1913 Land Act about 2 years ago. And I share it here because my work is concerned with the responses by policymakers and by poor people themselves to processes of jobless, de-agrarianization, and with the consequent incorporation of poor, vulnerable, and unruly populations within processes of a capitalist change in post-industrial and post-agrarian South Africa. And Jaco's poem seems to me to capture very precisely one dimension of this change, the change from a past in which people were enveloped, for better or for worse, within the blanket of an agrarian order, to a present in which they are enfolded instead by the order of money, coins that come and go, and of capitalist relations. My main purpose in this paper is to think about the theoretical frameworks that can help us understand this transition and its implications. I don't think I'm going to be saying very much that is really new. In a way, I'm simply connecting the dots of studies that have been done by other scholars. But my aim is to try to use that scholarship to try to question the boundaries of the kind of rural ghetto into which land and agrarian studies are often relegated. Agrarian questions may arise in the rural areas and in relation to questions of agricultural production, but the search for answers must take us to the towns and the cities, and to a consideration of the distributional politics of South African society as a whole. I'll try to summarize my argument in 12 main points. Firstly, I draw on two very distinct but overlapping scholarly traditions to inform my analysis. On the one hand, sorry, you don't want to see that lady right now. On the one hand, the analysis of welfare in distributive regimes, on the other, the Foucauldian study of governmentality and biopolitics. A biopolitical lens can make more visible some of the important connections between land and agrarian change and the politics of South African society more broadly. Now, historians of South African biopolitics argue that the South African distributive regime as it exists today was essentially formed in the social struggles that took place at the Rand in the 1920s. These struggles were resolved through a social pact around what was called at the time civilized labor. This accord centered on what T.H. Marshall was later to call the citizen-worker nexus, the notion that the privileged vehicle for the realization of social citizenship were the institutions and struggles of the formal, urbanized, and I should say male working class. In this case, it was also a pact to enshrine white domination and white privilege. While the new welfare state included white workers, Africans, and particularly rural Africans, were excluded. Now, land and agrarian change are key to this story. The biopolitical calculations that shaped the South African distributional regime throughout the 20th century depended on the role of what was then called the native reserves and later the Bantustans in South Africa's distributional economy. The native reserves functions not only as sites for subsistence agriculture, but also as zones of what social policy theorists call welfare production, and what Jim Ferguson calls distributive labor. The exclusion of poor Africans depended on the implicit assumption that for them, the impacts of capitalist change would be cushioned by the informal systems of reciprocal change in what was then called the structures of Bantu society. But this strategy of rural containment was doomed. As Jaco points out in his poem, it was undermined by the history of land dispossession itself. That sustaining agrarian order had vanished. The end of apartheid was thus linked to the promise of the full biopolitical inclusion of poor and landless people into the formal mechanisms of social citizenship. But as it happens, the existing distributive regime was not decisively transformed. Rather, it was simply deracialized. All South Africans, white and black, rural and urban, would be incorporated within a modernist distributional regime still based on the citizen-worker nexus and on the assumption of full employment. Today, as we can all see, this biopolitical strategy is failing. Instead of supporting more beneficial modes of incorporation, the post-apartheid distributional regime has more often intensified adverse incorporation. The reasons do not lie only in the legacy of past possession and exclusion, but also, as Ruth Hall has pointed out earlier today, in the enduring power of the economy's corporate core, which has been able to capture the regulatory agenda and monopolize the fruits of economic growth. Land and agrarian change is a key part of this story. As Ruth explained, a highly concentrated agri-food industry with efficient and centralized distribution networks intensified capitalist restructuring in the rural areas, undermining the livelihoods of small farmers and farm workers. Its vertically integrated and spatially extensive value chain further undermined the rural and urban informal sector and non-farm sector, bypassing local small enterprise and sucking money away from the local multipliers on which rural employment depends. The results have been large-scale unemployment and deepening inequality. Now I want to bring my slide back. So the most viable modes of biopolitical integration to emerge in post-apartheid South Africa are not based on the citizen-worker nexus, but on the capture of welfare through technologies of microfinance. Financial deepening and the rollout of the welfare system have in practice led to the inclusion of poor South Africans within a predatory market of financial loans and financial services. On the slide behind me, you can see an advertisement by a now defunct company called Cambist, which created a web platform that allowed middle-class South Africans to buy the debts of South Africans that have been subject to emolument detachment orders when they have defaulted on their debts. So you can retire in luxury, earning rates of between 19 and 24%, basically based on the suffering of the poorest of salaried and welfare-receiving South Africans. Just to drive the picture home, the advertisement there shows you a lemon being squeezed in a vice. It's very rarely that financial capital is as honest about the ways in which it extracts value. So salaries and social grant payments have been recycled back to corporate South Africa, producing new forms of poverty and disenfranchisement. The order of coins that come and go has not been able to sustain the networks and practices of sociality and care. And the role of social grants is acted not to reduce commodification, but to increase it. So the failure of modernist biopolitics creates a crisis for the post-apartheid political order. The legitimacy of that order still rests on the promise of biopolitical inclusion. At the same time, no alternative legitimizing discourse has been able to emerge, even though it is clear that this promise has not been kept. Instead, there is a proliferation of phenomena that seem to reenact this apartheid past. The return of strategies of rural containment through unelected traditional leaders. Here in the Western Cape, we've seen the ham-handed reintroduction of Dompas-like identity documents in some of our urban towns. Recourse to authoritarianism, clientelism, xenophobic and populist incitement, or simply brute force. All these allow kleptocratic elites to shore up their power, but they don't resolve the crisis. In fact, they exacerbate the crisis, and in the long run, there's a risk that they erode the fabric of social solidarity on which a modernist biopolitical project depends. So from this angle, I think it is possible to reframe the relevance of land and agrarian reform in South Africa. Debates about land and agrarian reform in South Africa are often confined to a kind of rural ghetto. It is seen as something relevant mainly to the rights and interests of those whose rights to land are going to be directly affected. And is seen as of interest to urban South Africans, mainly because of the need to address the legacy of the past and the threat supposedly being posed by land reform to urban food security. I think that looking at agrarian change through a distributive lens allows us to situate it much more clearly as a central issue in South African politics. But it also suggests that we need to reframe what land reform is about. As Jim Ferguson has pointed out, debates about land reform are often caught within a productionist paradigm, a paradigm that conflates land reform with agrarian reform, and that evaluates it simply in terms of the efficiency or the sustainability of producing agricultural goods. This ignores the fact that land has many uses, including its role in strategies of welfare production and distributive labor, and in strategies for decommodification or resisting commodification. This productionist misunderstanding has greatly facilitated the steady drift of land reform policy away from its original pro-poor intentions to its current fixation on establishing a black capitalist farming class, as Ruth has earlier explained. Now, what are the counter-hegemonic challenges to this process? One of the most popular candidates is provided by the food sovereignty movement, organized around the notion that the food system should be controlled by the people who produce, distribute, and consume food rather than multinational corporations. The food sovereignty movement positions itself as a global anti-capitalist alliance contesting power relations in the agro-food system. And it has articulated an emotionally appealing vision of the agro-food order as a moral community. And this has been very popular, including among middle-class groupings with concerns very different from those of the landless poor. But I don't think it offers very much help for any attempt to craft agro-food alternatives that can address the distributional and biopolitical challenges facing us in South Africa. It seems to deal with the complexities of present-day biopolitics simply by trying to wish them away, instead of confronting the trade-offs and the tensions that trouble the project of political and economic inclusion. We're invited to go off to an imaginary world characterized by economic autarky, local democracy, and the presumed authenticity of face-to-face economic transactions, as if it was possible today in the 21st century to dream that we, all of us, white and black, urban and rural, colonizer and settler and colonized, can be enfolded again in the comforting blanket of a vanished agrarian order. It seems to me that a progressive agro-food politics, if such a thing was possible, has to take aboard Jaco's bitter recognition that this agrarian order is gone. That doesn't mean we should accept the injustices of the present, but it means that I think an alternative agro-food politics needs to begin with the realities at hand. The decisive resolution of the agrarian question of capital, as Henry Bernstein has called it, in the interests of capital. The fragmented and hybrid nature of the livelihood strategies of poor and marginalized populations. The predominance of non-farm, non-agriculture economy, even in the deepest rural areas. And the need for biopolitical strategies to include all those marginalized by capitalist growth, even and especially those who cannot point to their ancestors' sacred ties to South African land. Thank you very much.